Welcome back to Life and Books and Everything. Today I want to read my latest article in World Opinions, and just to remind you, alert you again that hopefully sometime this summer, well, I'm going to take a little bit of a break from the podcasting and the articles, and then when we re-engage at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, hoping to have separated out these readings into its own platform so that it doesn't get jumbled up. Life and Books and Everything is partially long interviews and then short articles that I read, so we're going to try to separate the two, but for now they're in the same place. And today I want to read World Opinion's latest article that I've written entitled Anatomy of a Sneer. Watch for 3 ways progressive activists push their opponents into a corner. In 1776, the English historian Edward Gibbon released the first volume of his massive work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. As a quintessential example of Enlightenment history, with the assumed superiority of his then-current age of reason over the religious superstitions of earlier centuries, Gibbon's 6-volume magnum opus was a not-so-thinly veiled attack on Christianity as the chief culprit in Rome's demise. Gibbon faulted Christianity for undermining the tolerant regime of pagan religion and plunging Europe into a millennium-long dark age. When asked for his reaction to the decline and fall, the Christian apologist William Paley replied tersely, "Who can refute a sneer?" USA Today's Nancy Armour recently published an opinion piece entitled, What ESPN's Sam Ponder Calls Fairness is Plain Old Bigotry. Samantha Ponder is a well-known sports broadcaster with many high-profile television responsibilities to her credit. Ponder is also a Christian. The reason for Armour's denunciation is that Ponder recently voiced her disapproval of trans women, quote-unquote, that is, biological males who now identify as women, participating in women's sports. It is not hateful, Ponder said, to demand fairness in sports for girls. Armour, of course, thinks Ponder's position, which is shared by an overwhelming majority of Americans, is simply bigotry. While I hesitate to try to refute a sneer, Armour's article is such a succinct and virulent summary of typical arguments that I thought it might be useful to analyze the case she makes. For starters, let's consider what the debate over transgender athletes in sports is about. There are 3 questions we should be debating. 1, what is a woman? That's the starting place. Are male and female distinctions rooted in given biological realities, or are man and woman simply designations we choose for ourselves based on our own feelings and sense of identity? 2, can men become women and vice versa? We speak of someone transitioning from male to female, but we rarely stop to ask whether a change of appearance and a change of hormones actually turns a man into a woman. 3, do men, even ones who now identify as women, possess inherent advantages in athletic competition? This is the question of fairness. Is it fair for biological men to compete against biological women in sports? While at one level these questions may deal with philosophical or theological issues, most fundamentally they are matters of science. Until very recently, each of these 3 questions would have been answered relatively easily, just based on a shared understanding of biological givens and physiological realities. But these are not the questions Armour seeks to address or even contemplate. Instead, she follows a predictable outline meant to silence opposing viewpoints and to paint her opponents as dangerous, harmful people. While Armour's article is not important in its own right, and this whole kerfuffle will likely be quickly forgotten, it's worth noting how progressive activists push their opponents into an ideological and rhetorical corner. We can identify these arguments, quote-unquote, with 3 words: vocabulary, virtue, and victim. Let's start with vocabulary. Armour's title and first sentence make clear that those who disagree with her are bigots. That is, her opponents are not honest, reasonable people. They are motivated by, quote, hate, fear, and ignorance. They traffic in, quote, a cesspool of transphobic tweets. Ponder and those like her may talk about fairness, but, to use Armour's words, that's a sham, a boogeyman argument. Armour's strident vocabulary does the arguing for her. Ironically, she is the real bully in this debate. asserting that if you dare to disagree with her position, you are an ignorant, hateful monster. So vocabulary. Second, virtue. Armour attacks Ponder's character, claiming that she wants, quote, to see the transgender community marginalized out of existence. Unlike Armour, who virtuously advocates for women's sports, Ponder doesn't actually care about fairness. Notice that the evidence used to support this claim is almost entirely about what Ponder is said not to have done online. That is, she didn't use her platform to express outrage. She didn't use Twitter to urge her followers to call their representatives. She didn't tweet about ESPN's videos about Title IX last year. Virtue has come to be redefined in almost entirely digital terms. What people are like in private, how they treat people, what they may do outside the public view, these things don't count for virtue. Good people express the right outrage and send out the right tweets. So vocabulary, virtue, and then victim. According to Armour, Ponder speaks out, quote, of an inordinate amount of privilege to pile on a group that is already among the most vulnerable in our society, end quote. People who oppose transgender athletes or disagree with transgenderism more broadly have committed harm against transgender people and may even be responsible, Armour suggests, should someone from the trans community commit suicide. This is undoubtedly the hardest argument to refute because it is the most emotionally charged. Virtually no human being on the planet wants to see another human being commit suicide. And yet we have to muster up the courage to disagree with the assumptions behind the argument. Assumptions like individuals are not moral agents responsible for their own actions, or the assumption that intellectual and personal disagreements are tantamount to harm, or the assumption that unqualified acceptance and affirmation are the only things that count as love and support. Those are the assumptions behind Armour's arguments and the claim to victim status. Besides all this, it's worth observing that suicide rates have skyrocketed in this country at the same time that acceptance for newfound identities and sexualities has grown. Perhaps traditional morality is not to blame for our current age of anxiety. In the end, there may be no way to effectively refute a sneer, but dissecting the anatomy of the sneer is at least a start. As Christians, we should not give up on reason and rationality, even if the world increasingly seems to have little place for either.